I think I'm going to keep it quite short, and I find it quite hard following you, Dan, because that was just such a amazing example of a lot of similar things that I would say. And I think a lot of people here, what is amazing about this organisation and what you and Elizabeth have done is bringing a lot of people who are on a similar wavelength together. So really what I'd like to do is throw out some of the ideas that I talk about a lot, and then have a bit of a discussion. And then those of us who, those who would like to, we will do a workshop, and that's together with Malvika, who's there. And so I called this talk Reversing the Learning, Indigenous Epistemologies and Children's Experience. So my work for many years has been in India, but especially focusing on the tribal or indigenous people of India, or the Adivasis, as they're often known. And all these terms are totally argued about all the time, as anthropologists love to do. And in India, it's a very political country. Every term is often, contested. So especially in India, who is indigenous? And here am I, a white British person, talking about it. Not an easy kind of subject, but Adivasis means those who are the original inhabitants, the original dwellers. And especially of some places, you could say, well, yes, probably. But certainly they have a lot of, so for example, the UN, the rights of indigenous peoples legislation has been very contentious in India, but for a lot of the people, they really identify that with that a lot. India signed it, but it said it doesn't apply to India, so you can imagine the kind of contestation that happens. So one of the main things is, like this first book that I wrote, Sacrificing People, Invasions of a Tribal Landscape, it was reversing the gaze. So when I got to my first tribal village, and I thought of doing fieldwork there with a tribe called the Baiga in the middle of India. And I was sitting around the fire with people in the evening and saying, so, I'd really like to stay in a village like this and, learn from you and everything. And first they kind of roared with laughter at the idea that I'd be able to learn about their society within a year or two. And then they said, so what's the point? What would we get out of it? And those two questions have been informing me all the time in what is our role as an anthropologist? And I still believe that anthropology could really change things in the world. But as it stands at the present, it really couldn't very much. And I think one of the things would be if really we could start a process of reversing the learning, which is something in a way that you were talking about. A lot of the questions I get, and I especially have spoken all over India to many different kinds of audiences, both academic and also often activists. And so especially people from the left, from a Marxist tradition, would say, well, aren't you romanticizing the tribal people or something like that? And I'm sure a lot of you have had questions like that or asked questions like that. And I think to me, one cannot speak positively about the tribal cultures often without being accused of that, because it's so the kind of assumptions of a kind of social evolutionism are so deeply ingrained into most of our ideologies. I mean, a lot of, anthropologists have really begun to think outside that, but even for us, and especially for me, taking on economics is a really important quest that I want to see more and more anthropologists engage with, because we are kind of often in communication with peoples who really have different kinds of economy and on much more non-exploitative economies especially, and I think we need to take on this kind of hegemony of, like, economics to me is a kind of belief system. And if you here in Oxford, it's like centuries of theologians and orthodoxy. You have to be Protestant or Catholic, or you have to, if you're a heretical, you can be burnt alive or whatever. And I think in a way, the dogma of the economists, who, if you're not part of the elite system, you can't even question it. They won't even know that you question it, so there's no question of burning you at the stake. But, I mean, on the front line, you know, if you're in Brazil or India and you're questioning that model, you certainly can be killed by the police or whatever, and very easily. And I'm thinking of people like Chomsky, who are now saying, you know, we have to learn from the indigenous peoples because they are the ones who have the most experience of living close to the earth without destroying it. But at the same time, many of us maybe are on different quests of becoming indigenous in different ways. And for me personally, it was lovely to meet somebody else from Southwest Wales, where there's a huge movement of going back to nature. Like, very often people say, so do you want us to go back to the trees or something? But actually, you know, there are people in Southwest Wales, as in so many other places, who are really going back to nature. And in terms of building their own houses, certainly growing their own foods, trying to make their own economies and everything. And one of the inspirations has been especially Native Americans. So in our part of Southwest Wales, like every month, or sometimes even different groups twice a month, on the full moon and the new moon, there are sweat lodges and many other customs that come from, in whatever kind of bastardized way, but that inspiration from the indigenous is very strong too. So obviously, all of you will kind of understand what has happened in, obviously, a lot of North America, Australia, or places is direct genocide. But what is happening also, what happened after the direct genocide was kind of cultural genocide, when the children of the communities were taken into boarding schools especially, and not allowed to speak their own language or practice their own religion or have their hair long or whatever it was. And you'll know about, for example, Chief Joseph is one of my reference points. Is, I mean, it's quoted in Bury My Heart and Wounded Knee, but when he was asked, why are you against schools? He said, well, we think that they teach people to argue about God, that schools and churches are connected, and we don't want to learn that. I mean, you know, I know I'm speaking here to people who know these stories very, very well. And it's also, one of my main teachers was this person who published a book only a couple of years ago, because his name's Madhu Ramnath, and he's not well known, but he, I would say, knows the indigenous scene in India better than anybody else, and partly because he's lived with a community called the Durwa, and lived over many, many, many years, so that he is even sometimes mistaken by them for one of them. And he's called it Autobiographical Footnotes to the Anthropology of the Durwa, which is a kind of polemical, his kind of polemic of what do we mean when we do an anthropology of a people. And one of the, several people here are talking about shamanism, and for me, that is a very important subject. I mean, the tribal people in India too are what you could call shamanic. They go into trance, they communicate with spirits, it's often a huge show of what you could call a kind of psychodrama when people go into trance, and people cry, people laugh, there's a huge humor in it. But what I realized reading this book is most anthropologists would not be able to understand really much of what's going on in that, because the people are drunk, there's kind of shouting and screaming, and the references to a large number of kind of deceased relatives, The language is often very archaic and very colloquial, mixed together. But a huge amount of things come in, and also dreams. So when Cesar was started this morning with dreams, talking about shamanism, for me that is a lot of the knowledge in the tribal communities is passed on, but a lot of it is also, it's coming through dreams or coming through the spirits in shamanic sessions. And talking about this here in Oxford, I find really wonderful, because somehow the opposite kind of knowledge, it's not something you can kind of put on a shelf in the Bodleian Library. Even, I would not say there's a single book about the religion of the Adivasis that really does more than scratch the surface, because it's like the opposite of book kind of knowledge in a way. Like several people were saying, oral traditions, which are often killed by the schooling process that is trying to impart literacy, they exist in a different kind of knowledge. They're always alive, for one thing. And the way that they exist in the act of communicating, obviously. And as you were saying, that mobile phones especially are kind of killing this, or computers too, because they're kind of an idea that this is real knowledge or this is official knowledge. This exists because it's on the computer or something, as opposed to what's in my heart or hands or something. One of the ways that was my first book. My second book was when an activist in Orissa came to me and said, okay, you've written this great book about the invasion of this tribal area by the British, by the administrators, by the missionaries, by the anthropologists, but what about the invasion by the mining companies? So Orissa has a lot of bauxite, so the aluminium companies are all interested, and then there were these Adivasi movements trying to oppose them. So together we wrote a major book about the aluminium industry from the point of view of Adivasis. So that's, again, it's an act of, for me, reverse anthropology, that from the experience of Adivasis, understanding the whole history of the aluminium industry, which involves especially the links with the arms industry, with big dams, because in Brazil, above all, these big dams are being built, as in India, the biggest of them for the aluminium industry. And finance, and a lot of them are financed from London, and so on, to really understand that economics, but from the grassroots up. And actually that book played a major part in one of the movements that so far has been successful against mining this mountain, Nyamgiri, that has these iconic Dongria Kond community there. So then if you, and one of some of the words that I would quote, so in a way my main teachers have been Adivasis, among many other teachers, but some of the things that they say, there's a kind of wit, or the kind of, what they say in words sometimes just goes to the heart of matter. And to give a few examples, and translating this mostly from Oriya into English, it's one of the leaders of the Dongria standing up in a public meeting and saying, people say there's millions of pounds millions of rupees in our Nyamgiri mountain, but it's not money that's up there, it's our mother, father, and we must protect her. And he shows his axe, and that goes against that. Every Oriya child reads in Oriya in the state level textbook. Orissa is one of the poorest states in India, but one of the richest in minerals. So the implication is all we have to do is mine the minerals and we'll become rich. But, that's not how mining companies have ever worked. So one of the phrases that have been formed, maybe in India, but certainly taken up by the World Bank, is development-induced displacement. And more I've tried to say it's not development, obviously for the tribal people. There's no way this is development. It's pure destruction of communities and ecosystems. But it is investment. It's all driven by investment. So investment-induced dispossession, really. So coming to children experience, a lot of them what do children experience when they go to a school? And here I'm talking about, okay, to start with, the children directly coming from the tribal communities. So there has been, which Malvak will talk about a little bit at the beginning of our workshop, there's been a long, their own indigenous systems of education are very, very sophisticated. But when schools were introduced from, say, the 1930s or whatever, or for many of them from the 1950s or 60s, the first thing they're taught is basically discipline. Like, sit down, stand up, and any infringement, punishment, and one of the ways they're taught also is humiliation. And this is why there's a kind of linguistic genocide going on in India, because the tribal languages, obviously India is a country of many, many languages, and if you get a 100 rupee note, 100 rupees is written in 20 different languages on the note. Lovely linguistic diversity, but each one of those languages becomes a tyrant towards the minorities within that state. So, for example, Gondi, the language of the Gonds in central India, is a language that is, like the other ones, it's maybe listed as spoken by 3 million people, but nowadays the number is far, far smaller than that. And I remember a friend of Malvika's who runs a scheme for urban displaced tribal children. So some Gonds have come into Bhopal, the capital of Madhya Pradesh, and a little bit like the kind of urban children that you might be dealing with. It's for speaking their language at school, these girls were telling us how they've been humiliated again and again, until then they formed their own project, and then they actually had a project translating Greek plays and Shakespeare and things into Gondi, and then performing that, and beginning to use that in the class alongside Hindi or other languages. Because one of the themes of what's happening with the mainstream education is they're being taught either in English or in Hindi or in the state language, and obviously missionaries started that, and there's a huge movement in many tribal pockets now to use English, because that can get them a few more steps up the ladder, but still, it's not only they're losing their culture, but its employment is still just as difficult. And above all, the education process, because it privileges mental thought over handwork. I mean, the whole caste hierarchy is based on a hierarchy of thinking and mental work over the dirtiness of using a hand. So a lot of the children, after they've been educated for a few years, they won't want to work in the fields anymore with their families and everything. So there's a massive alienation that is going on there. One of the main themes too is it's not only the epistemologies and the languages that are being destroyed, but the value system. So among these things that I've often heard tribal people say is when the displaced are often offered money, and they often say, we cannot eat money. And that phrase that I've heard many, many times, it goes very deep, because that's the opposite of how the Human Development Index is always measured by how the income is going up. And another thing that's quite funny in India, one of the main phrases for taking a bribe is, ye log paisa kha liya. These people have eaten money. To eat money is the colloquial term for taking a bribe. So when tribal people are saying, we cannot eat money, they're both saying something literal, that you can't actually put money in your mouth. And they know that as the area is invaded, the price of things go up, they can't grow their food anymore. Literally, money will not feed them. But they're also saying, that's not our custom. We can't just take bribes. That's not who we are. And they see how the communities are divided by the rich ones who do eat money. In that sense, they do take compensation bribes. Another thing I remember hearing somebody say was, in the Supreme Court, this Niyamgiri case went there for 3 sessions, and there were 3 judges, including the top judge in the country, and one of the key judges who drove this case was from Orissa. And I heard later from somebody an inside story of how he had received a huge bribe. But he made a show in the Supreme Court of saying, okay, so is this from Vedanta or Sterlite? Which is a subsidiary of which? And which are you? And he made the whole conversation revolve around kind of trivia thing. And when somebody produced a book about the Dongria, and he kind of shouted at them that this is not a case about tribals, it's just, I will not allow this. The Chief Justice of India, I remember him saying that and throwing the book down. And then coming out and talking to some of the cons who were outside. They weren't barefoot, kind of allowed inside the Supreme Court. And this conned elder said just these 4 words, Tara karma, amara dharma, which means it's his karma, it's our dharma. And, that's amazing in India because you don't hear the words karma and dharma just spoken in common language, usually like that. But here there are tribal people who maybe or may not be Hindu according to different definitions. And here he's saying it's his karma. And, that's just like all of you will know roughly what the meaning is. It's his action, it's his sin. It's our dharma, it's our right and duty to stand and protect the mountain. So just in 4 words, summarizing the whole situation and Indian philosophy. And many things like this one can quote of how indigenous people, or view from grassroots, is really something that can totally open your mind and inspire you. And in terms of the value system, one of the things that, and this is where I'd love feedback, that really kind of, I feel the truth of this more and more, but I would love to, to know from you if you feel it too. It's one of the key values of modern liberal democracy, or whatever you call it, us, is competition. That it's always said, we have a competitive economy, a level playing field, when we know it's not quite that simple. We have a parliamentary system that is democratic, it means competitive. So when we go to another country and we quite try and make sure the elections are fair, it's all nice competition. But in a way, there's a quotation from somebody who was Oxford educated, one of the first Adivasis who was called Jaipal Singh Munda. And he was he really stood up for the Adivasis in what was called the Constituent Assembly debates from 1946, before independence, to 1950. And in one of those debates, Nehru was there, who became the first Prime Minister of India, saying, we must bring democracy to the tribal areas. And Jaipal Singh saying, Nehru, you cannot bring democracy to the tribal people. They're the most democratic people on earth. You have to learn democratic ways from them. And there's a deep truth in that. So what is this tribal democracy? It's very hard to analyze. And again, I don't know a single kind of study that has really done that. But one of the ways they do it is by, it's a kind of, and I believe it's the same with a lot of American Indian traditions, that everybody had to agree. What they're aiming for is consensus. It's not a divisive thing that, okay, that person got 51%, that person got 49%, that person wins. It's really the community needs to agree. And especially you see this in law, where, we have taken for granted a kind of the Roman competitive legal system where we pay lawyers and one party is proved right, the other is proved wrong. And the whole purpose of this is described from many tribal communities in India, that the whole purpose of the legal process, that people shout and scream in the process, they really argue and anything's allowed. But then the aim of it is to reconcile the contestants, that very often both sides will be fined, maybe one side more than the other, but the aim is those fines then pay for a feast of reconciliation. And that is the aim of the process. And, can you imagine anything more civilized, really, than that? Similarly, in economics, it's the whole of our economic system is based on debt, really, and exploitation, profit, growth, obviously. And very often it's exchange labour, so people work on each other's fields, and many other, what you could call kind of an Adivasi economics. And so in education also, I mean, more and more looking at education in India, right from the earliest age, it's exams and tests again and again and again. Who got more marks? And I've seen a neighbour who I thought I knew really well just hit his child over the head when he hadn't attended properly in an exam and he got low marks. And that is the attitude again and again. And obviously in the tribal context, there's nothing competitive about the learning process. It's really, in fact, it's often said that tribal parents, at least in the tradition, think they never discipline their children. And this friend Madhu, I remember him telling me a story of how he was there with the headman and suddenly came upon a place in the forest where his grandson was there. And Madhu wanted to kind of creep up on the child and surprise him. But the child was playing at what they do. They make a kind of mandala of leaves and stones and things. And the old man said, no, you mustn't. He's in his own space now. You have to leave him. And it's that way children, it's taken for granted. They will learn from each other and from themselves. And similarly with one of the main kind of sports or leisure activities in these societies is dance. And there's so many different beats, but now what is being promoted, especially by the mining companies, is sport. So tribal children are often brilliant at sport because they're very physical, and they do football, basketball, and a lot of the kind of focus of now Adivasi identity is to prove that they can go to the Olympic level in sports. But it's all focused on competition, obviously, while with dance, now again it's being promoted onto the stage, so you often see, maybe in Brazil you get the same thing, but certainly in India, I've been to a place where Tata Steel has 50 different tribal groups from different tribal communities to come and perform their dances. But when you perform on stage, it's a completely different thing from, in a way, when you see the dancing that happens at night when different communities meet, it's the most radical expression of democracy, where it goes on all night. There's a lot of kind of love affairs. It's very, with the drumming, there's huge contestation that comes, there's huge tension that comes, but it's all directed into this kind of communal activity. Or with the shamanic dancing, I mean, I've seen a time when at a sacrifice up on the mountain, and it's women who are shamans, and the drummer isn't getting the correct beat of the spirit she is trying to get him to do, and she's pushing her breasts in the man's face while he's trying to find the right beat to kind of an expression of kind of female anger like you wouldn't normally see in civilized, quote, society. So I think that's all I want to say for the moment. But one of the themes maybe then is how it leads on to the workshop is that in some ways, after I was finishing my PhD and then kind of recovering from that process in a way, I needed a lot of healing, and I was working with a healer who kept saying, get out of your head. What are you feeling? And realizing the feeling process is very intellectualized. When we become very, quote, educated, it's something that takes us out of our bodies and out of our direct contact with our own feeling. So reversing the learning becomes something we need to do individually as well as in terms of community.